The GPS had been telling me to turn left for the last 3 miles, but I'd seen nothing except cornfields and more cornfields until the gravel driveway appeared between 2 weathered fence posts. My Honda Civic bounced over the uneven stones, packed full with everything I owned, crammed into the back seat and trunk. Moving across 3 states for a farm job wasn't exactly the career path I'd planned, but student loans didn't care about my 5-year plan. The main farmhouse sat about 50 yards ahead, a 2-story structure with white siding that had seen better decades. Chickens wandered freely across the front yard, pecking at invisible insects in the packed dirt. Behind the house, I could make out the red roof of a barn and what looked like a smaller building tucked between some oak trees. I parked next to a pickup truck that probably dated back to the Clinton administration and killed the engine. The heat hit me immediately when I opened the door. That thick, humid air that made my shirt stick to my back within seconds. Michigan summers were nothing compared to whatever circle of hell I'd driven into here in rural Indiana. "You must be Emily." The voice belonged to a man walking toward me from the direction of the barn. Robert Mitchell looked exactly like I'd expected from our phone conversations. Weathered face, work boots that had seen serious use, and the kind of tan that came from decades of outdoor labor. He had to be in his 70s, but he moved with the steady confidence of someone who'd been doing physical work his entire life. "That's me." I grabbed my largest duffel bag from the trunk. "Thanks again for letting me start so quickly." "No problem at all. We've been needing the help." He gestured toward the smaller building I'd noticed earlier. "Let me show you to the cottage. You can get settled before we talk about the work schedule." The cottage turned out to be a converted garage or workshop, maybe 400 square feet total. Robert unlocked the front door and stepped aside to let me in first. The interior was simple but clean. A small kitchen area, a living room with a couch that had seen better years, and a doorway leading to what I assumed was the bedroom and bathroom. "Previous owner used this as a guest house," Robert explained, running his hand along the kitchen counter. "Margaret and I had it cleaned up when we knew you were coming. Should have everything you need." I dropped my bag next to the couch and looked around. The place felt isolated but not unpleasant. Through the kitchen window, I could see the main house about 30 yards away. "This is perfect, really." "Good. I'll let you bring in your things, and then—" "Robert." The voice came from behind us. A woman stood in the doorway, holding what looked like a folded piece of paper. Margaret Mitchell shared her husband's weathered appearance, but where Robert's face showed the comfortable wear of physical labor, hers carried a different kind of intensity. Her eyes swept over me with an assessment that made me want to stand up straighter. "Margaret, this is Emily Thompson." "Hello, dear." Margaret stepped into the cottage, but her expression remained serious. "I hope the drive wasn't too difficult." "Not bad at all. About 6 hours from Michigan." Margaret nodded, but didn't respond to the small talk. Instead, she unfolded the paper in her hands. "Before you get too comfortable, we need to go over some important safety guidelines." I glanced at Robert, who had moved to lean against the kitchen counter. His posture suggested this was routine, but something about the way he avoided making eye contact made my stomach tighten slightly. "Safety guidelines?" "Rules, really." Margaret smoothed the paper against the kitchen table. Her handwriting covered the page in neat, careful script. "Living out here, especially in the cottage, requires following certain protocols." I moved closer to read over her shoulder. The list contained 7 numbered items, written in what looked like blue ink. 1. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, a black dog will scratch at the back door. Let it in immediately and feed it 1 can of tuna. Do not attempt to pet or interact with it beyond feeding. 2. Set your alarm for 3:03 a.m. Check that the barn door is securely closed. If it is open, call Robert immediately. Do not enter the barn alone. 3. If you hear 3 knocks at the front door at any time between 5 and 6 a.m., knock back 4 times, wait for 1 return knock, then remain silent until sunrise. 4. When Robert works in the fields at night, keep all your lights off and do not look out the windows. 5. Never answer if you hear an old woman's voice calling for help from the basement of the main house. 6. Keep at least 6 cans of tuna in your refrigerator at all times. 7. If any of these rules are broken, notify Robert and Margaret immediately. I read through the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When I looked up, both Robert and Margaret were watching me with expressions that suggested they expected a serious response. Is this some kind of initiation thing? Like hazing for new farmhands? Margaret's face didn't change. These rules exist for your safety, Emily. Following them exactly isn't a suggestion. But a black dog at 2:17 in the morning? Specific knocking patterns? I gestured at the paper. This reads like something from a horror movie. Robert cleared his throat. I know it sounds strange, but Margaret's right about following them. We've had people work here before who thought they knew better. What happened to them? They left. Margaret's answer came quickly, but something in her tone made it feel incomplete. The important thing is that you understand how serious this is. Living in the cottage means accepting certain responsibilities. I looked between them, trying to read their faces. Robert appeared uncomfortable but determined. Margaret showed no signs of backing down from what felt like the most bizarre job orientation in history. The rational part of my brain insisted this had to be some kind of test. Maybe they wanted to see how I'd react to weird instructions or whether I'd panic and quit on the first day. Okay. I folded the paper and slipped it into my back pocket. I'll follow your rules. Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. Do you have any questions about them? Just one. What if nothing happens? Like, what if no black dog shows up at 2:17? It will, Margaret said with complete certainty. But if for some reason it doesn't, still set your alarm for 3:03 and check the barn. Robert pushed off from the counter. Why don't you get your things settled? We can talk about the regular farm work over dinner. The next hour passed in a blur of unpacking and organizing. My entire life fit into the cottage's small closet and a single dresser, which felt both liberating and slightly depressing. I'd left behind a shared apartment in Grand Rapids, a job at a marketing firm that barely covered my student loan payments, and a relationship that had been limping toward its inevitable end for months. The cottage felt like a clean slate, even if it came with the strangest employee handbook I'd ever encountered. Robert knocked on my door just after 6 o'clock. Dinner's ready if you want to join us. The main house felt larger inside than it appeared from the cottage. The kitchen table was set for 3, with Margaret pulling a casserole dish from the oven. The meal was simple, some kind of chicken and rice combination, green beans from what Robert explained was their own garden, and fresh bread that Margaret had baked that afternoon. So the work schedule is pretty straightforward, Robert said between bites. Chickens need feeding twice a day. Eggs collected in the afternoon. There's always maintenance projects around the property. Fixing fences, cleaning equipment, that sort of thing. Sounds manageable. What time do you usually start in the morning? 7:30, 8 o'clock. Depends on the weather and what needs doing. Robert paused to consider something. You'll probably want to get yourself on a good sleep schedule. Those nighttime rules mean you'll be up a few times. Margaret set down her fork. The most important thing is consistency. Set your alarms, follow the list exactly, and don't try to improvise. What happens if I sleep through an alarm? The question created an uncomfortable silence. Robert and Margaret exchanged a look that lasted several seconds longer than felt natural. Don't, Margaret finally said. Find a way to make sure you wake up. After dinner, I helped with the dishes and made polite conversation about the farm's history, the local area, and what I could expect from Indiana weather. Both Robert and Margaret seemed more relaxed once we moved away from the topic of rules, though I noticed Margaret kept glancing at the kitchen clock as the evening progressed. By 9 o'clock, exhaustion from the drive and the stress of moving had caught up with me. I thanked them for dinner and headed back to the cottage. already looking forward to collapsing into bed. The cottage felt different at night, smaller somehow, and more isolated. I could see the warm glow of lights from the main house windows, but the distance between the buildings felt much greater in the darkness. I checked the locks on both the front and back doors, then set up my phone charger next to the bed. Margaret's list sat on my nightstand, the blue ink visible even in the dim light from my phone screen. I read through it one more time, shaking my head at the specificity of it all. 2:17 a.m. for a black dog. 3:03 a.m. to check the barn, knocking patterns and tuna cans and mysterious old women in basements. The whole thing felt like an elaborate joke, but Margaret's intensity had been completely genuine. Either she was an incredible actress, or she truly believed that following these rules was a matter of life and death. The rational explanation was that this was some kind of tradition, maybe something Robert's family had been doing for generations to mess with new employees. I set my phone alarm for 2:15 a.m., figuring I'd give them the benefit of the doubt for one night. If nothing happened, I'd have proof that the whole thing was nonsense, and I could sleep normally from then on. The bed was more comfortable than I'd expected, and the cottage was blessedly quiet after months of living with paper-thin apartment walls. I was asleep within minutes of my head hitting the pillow, my phone charging on the nightstand beside Margaret's ridiculous list. The night passed without interruption. No black dog scratched at my door. No mysterious sounds woke me up. When my eyes opened, bright morning sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window, and my phone showed 7:43 a.m. I'd slept through my 2:15 alarm completely, and the world hadn't ended. I lay in bed for a few minutes, feeling vindicated. The rules were exactly what I'd suspected, a harmless tradition designed to test new employees. Margaret's serious expression and dire warnings had been nothing more than good acting. I'd passed their little test by agreeing to follow the rules, and now I could focus on the actual job of working on their farm. Rolling out of bed, I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, ready to start my first real day at the Mitchell farm. The cottage felt normal and welcoming in the morning light, and I could hear the distant sounds of chickens outside the window. Whatever strange game Robert and Margaret had been playing with their midnight rules, I was confident I'd figured it out. The joke was on them, though. I'd been too tired to wake up for their elaborate prank, and nothing had happened, just like I'd expected. My second night at the cottage, I set my phone alarm for 2:15 a.m., with the same smug confidence I'd felt that morning. The whole day had passed normally, helping Robert fix a section of fence, collecting eggs from chickens that seemed more interested in pecking my shoes than laying anything useful, learning the basics of operating their ancient tractor. Margaret had asked twice if I had any questions about the rules, and each time I'd assured her I understood them perfectly. What I didn't mention was my absolute certainty that none of it would matter. The alarm buzzed against my nightstand, pulling me from shallow sleep. I fumbled for the phone, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. 2:15 a.m. exactly. I turned off the alarm and stretched, already planning to roll over and go back to sleep. 2 more minutes, and when nothing happened at 2:17, I'd have definitive proof that the Mitchell's rules were nothing more than an elaborate initiation ritual. I lay there listening to the cottage's quiet, settling sounds, the soft creak of old wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Through the bedroom window, I could see the main house sitting dark and peaceful in the distance. No mysterious figures moving around, no supernatural activity of any kind. The scratching started at exactly 2:17 a.m. Slow, deliberate sounds came from the back door, the unmistakable noise of claws dragging against wood. Not frantic or desperate, but methodical, as if something was announcing its presence with calculated patience. Each scrape sent ice through my veins, and I found myself sitting bolt upright in bed, every muscle in my body suddenly tense. It had to be a raccoon, or maybe one of the farm cats Robert had mentioned. Something perfectly normal that happened to show up at the exact time Margaret's ridiculous list predicted. I forced myself to get out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor as I made my way toward the kitchen. The scratching continued, maintaining its steady rhythm. Whatever was out there knew I was awake. I could sense that somehow, though I couldn't explain why. The sound wasn't random animal behavior. It was purposeful, waiting. I approached the back door with trembling legs, my hand hovering over the deadbolt I'd locked before going to bed. The scratching stopped the moment I reached for it, leaving only silence and my own rapid breathing. Through the small window in the door, I could make out a dark shape sitting just outside, barely visible in the pale moonlight. When I unlocked the door and pulled it open, a massive black dog sat waiting on the small concrete step. Its yellow eyes met mine immediately, and the bottom dropped out of my stomach. The animal was enormous, easily twice the size of any dog I'd ever seen, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. But what made my blood turn to ice was the intelligence in those yellow eyes. This wasn't a lost pet or a stray looking for food. This was something else entirely. The dog rose to its feet and walked past me into the cottage without invitation, its presence filling the small kitchen with an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the animal settled in the center of the room and fixed those unsettling eyes on me again. The temperature in the kitchen felt like it had dropped 20 degrees in the span of seconds. Margaret's list said to feed it 1 can of tuna. My hands shook as I moved to the refrigerator, the dog's gaze following my every movement. I grabbed one of the cans I'd bought during my grocery run earlier that day, my fingers struggling with the pull tab as the animal watched in complete silence. The metal lid came free with a soft pop, and I placed the open can on the floor tiles, stepping back quickly. The dog moved to the tuna and began eating, but even that was wrong somehow. No sounds of chewing or lapping, no typical dog behavior, just the mechanical consumption of food while those yellow eyes continued to track me. I pressed my back against the kitchen counter, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid of whatever might happen if I broke some unspoken rule about how to behave around this thing. After finishing the tuna, the dog settled back onto the kitchen tiles, lying down but keeping its head raised, and those unnatural eyes locked on my face. The cold radiating from its presence made goosebumps rise along my arms, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to generate some warmth. Time moved like molasses as we stared at each other, me terrified and confused, the dog patient and unnaturally still. Around 2:45 a.m., the animal simply vanished. One moment it was there, watching me with those intelligent yellow eyes, and the next moment the kitchen was empty. The temperature returned to normal instantly, leaving me standing alone in my pajamas, staring at an empty tuna can on the floor. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, waiting for something else to happen. When nothing did, I picked up the can and threw it in the trash, my hands still shaking. The whole encounter felt like a vivid nightmare, except for the lingering smell of tuna and the very real evidence that something had eaten from that can. Back in the bedroom, I set another alarm for 3:03 a.m., my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. Margaret's rules weren't a prank. They weren't some elaborate joke designed to mess with new employees. That thing in my kitchen had been real, and it had appeared at exactly the time her list predicted. When the 3:03 alarm buzzed, I was so rattled by the dog encounter that my brain refused to function properly. I turned off the alarm and stared at the ceiling, my thoughts cycling between terror and disbelief. The barn. I was supposed to check that the barn door was securely closed, but my legs felt like water. And the idea of leaving the cottage again, of walking across the dark yard to check on anything, seemed impossible. I fell back asleep instead, exhausted by adrenaline and fear. Morning came with bright sunshine and the distant sound of chickens, making the night's events feel even more surreal. I dressed quickly and walked to the main house, where Margaret was already setting breakfast on the table. Robert sat reading what looked like a farming magazine, his coffee cup steaming in the early light. "How did you sleep, dear?" Margaret asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew the answer. The dog came, at 2:17, just like you said. Robert looked up from his magazine, his weathered face serious. And you fed it? Yes. 1 can of tuna, exactly like the list said. Margaret nodded approvingly, but Robert's expression remained focused. What about the barn check? My stomach dropped. I forgot. I was so shaken up by the dog that when my alarm went off at 3:03, I fell back asleep. Robert's face darkened and he set down his magazine with deliberate care. Margaret went pale, her hand moving to grip the back of her chair. You forgot? Margaret's voice carried a weight that made me want to shrink into myself. I'm sorry. I was just... Emily. Margaret's tone cut through my stammered apology. These rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines or helpful hints. They're the only things keeping you alive on this property. Robert was already standing, reaching for his jacket from a hook by the kitchen door. I need to check the barn now. Robert, Margaret started. I know. His voice was grim as he headed for the door. I'll be thorough. I watched through the kitchen window as Robert walked across the yard toward the barn, his posture tense and alert. He disappeared around the side of the building, and I lost sight of him for what felt like an eternity. Margaret paced the kitchen, checking the clock every few minutes, her anxiety filling the room like smoke. 20 minutes passed before Robert reappeared, walking back toward the house with visible relief on his face. When he came through the kitchen door, he looked exhausted despite the early hour. Everything's secure, he said, hanging his jacket back on the hook. Door was closed tight, no signs of disturbance. Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank God. Robert turned to me, his expression serious but not unkind. You got lucky, Emily. Very lucky. Next time you might not be. I nodded, understanding with crystal clarity that whatever game I'd thought I was playing had rules far more serious than I'd imagined. The black dog with yellow eyes had been real. Margaret's warnings were real. And I'd just learned that forgetting to follow the rules could have consequences I wasn't prepared to face. I picked at my dinner, unable to focus on anything except the clock on the kitchen wall. Each tick felt deliberate, marking time until darkness would fall, and I'd have to face another night in the cottage. The mashed potatoes turned to paste in my mouth, and I gave up pretending to eat after a few bites. Margaret noticed immediately. She'd been watching me throughout the meal with that same intense expression I'd seen on my first day, like she was evaluating my mental state for signs of weakness or breakdown. You're scared, she said, setting down her fork. Robert looked up from his plate, his weathered face creased with concern. Maybe we should... No. Margaret's voice cut him off firmly. She needs to understand what she's dealing with. I pushed my plate away, my appetite completely gone. I already understand. The black dog was real. Everything on your list is real. Do you? Margaret leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. Because understanding and truly comprehending are two different things, Emily. You've seen one small piece of what lives on this property. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Margaret continued without acknowledging his discomfort. This farm has been in Robert's family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather was the first to encounter them back in 1923. He tried to fight what he found, tried to drive them away or destroy them. Margaret's voice carried the weight of old tragedy. He lasted 6 months before they took him. Took him? His body was never found, just his clothes, folded neatly on his bed like he'd simply evaporated. Margaret's eyes never left my face. His son, Robert's grandfather, was smarter. He learned to negotiate. The rules aren't arbitrary, Emily. They're a treaty. I looked between them, trying to process what she was telling me. A treaty? With what? Things that were here long before people started farming this land. Things that don't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. Margaret stood and began clearing the dinner plates, her movements precise and controlled. The previous farmhands who didn't follow the rules, they didn't just quit and leave. They died. The word hung in the air between us like a physical weight. Robert finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Margaret's telling you this because you need to know the stakes. What happened last night when you forgot the barn check? We got lucky. Very lucky. I thought about the relief on Robert's face when he'd emerged from the barn that morning. The exhaustion that had seemed to age him years in the span of 20 minutes. What would have happened if the door had been open? Margaret paused in her plate clearing, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The last person who let something out of that barn, we found pieces of him scattered across 3 counties. My stomach lurched, and I had to swallow hard to keep from getting sick right there at the kitchen table. How many people have worked here before me? 14 over the past 10 years. Robert's answer came without hesitation, like he'd memorized the number. 12 of them left after the first week when they realized this wasn't a normal farm job. 2 of them thought they were smarter than generations of experience. Margaret resumed her cleaning, but her movements had become more aggressive. The rules exist because they work, Emily. They keep you alive, and they keep those things contained to specific times and behaviors. Breaking them isn't just dangerous for you, it's dangerous for everyone. After dinner, I retreated to the cottage with Margaret's words echoing in my head. The small space felt even more isolated than usual, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. I checked the locks on both doors 3 times, arranged 6 cans of tuna in the refrigerator where I could grab them quickly, and set my phone alarm for 2:15 a.m. Then I sat on the couch and watched the time crawl forward with agonizing slowness. 9:30 p.m. became 10:15, then 11:45. Each minute felt like an hour, and I found myself checking my phone constantly, as if the numbers might suddenly jump forward and spare me the wait. The cottage's normal settling sound seemed amplified in the darkness. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind against the windows made me tense with anticipation. By 1 a.m., I was pacing the small living room, unable to sit still. My nerves felt like live wires under my skin, and the weight of Margaret's warnings pressed down on me like a physical presence. 14 people. 12 who left. 2 who died because they thought they knew better than a century of carefully negotiated survival. At 2:15, my alarm buzzed with mechanical precision. I turned it off and moved toward the back door, my legs unsteady but my resolve firm. Whatever was coming, I would follow the rules exactly. No improvisation, no second guessing. No mistakes that could end with pieces of me scattered across 3 counties. The scratching started at 2:17, but this time it sounded different. More aggressive, more insistent. The claws dragged against the wood with deliberate force, creating deep gouges I could hear even through the solid door. Whatever was out there wasn't just announcing its presence. It was demanding entry. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping back quickly as the massive black dog pushed past me into the kitchen. The temperature drop was immediate and severe, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. But tonight, I noticed more details, and all of them were wrong. The dog's fur absorbed light completely, creating a hole in my vision where it sat. Its yellow eyes glowed with their own illumination, casting faint reflections on the kitchen walls. And when it breathed, the sound was all wrong. Too slow, too rhythmic, like a mechanical bellows rather than living lungs. I grabbed a can of tuna from the refrigerator, my hands steadier than they'd been the night before. Fear was still there, but it was controlled now, focused into careful attention to every detail Margaret had stressed. I opened the can and placed it on the floor, then retreated to the far side of the kitchen. The dog moved to the tuna, but instead of eating immediately, it sat beside the can and fixed those unnatural eyes on me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, and I realized it was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. Testing me, maybe. Evaluating whether I would panic or try to do something stupid. Eventually, it began eating with that same wrong, silent consumption I'd witnessed before. But this time I watched its breathing carefully, counting the intervals between each rise and fall of its massive chest. 10 seconds in, 15 seconds out. No living animal breathed that slowly. The dog finished the tuna and settled onto the kitchen tiles, but tonight it didn't just lie down. It positioned itself between me and both the front and back doors, effectively trapping me in the kitchen area. The message was clear. I wasn't going anywhere until it decided to leave. At 2:45, it vanished as suddenly as before, taking the oppressive cold with it. I waited several minutes before moving, making sure it was truly gone before I cleaned up the empty tuna can and prepared for the next checkpoint. My 3:03 alarm went off, and I forced myself to walk across the dark yard to the barn. The building loomed against the night sky, its red roof barely visible in the pale moonlight. I approached the main doors with careful steps, my phone's flashlight beam shaking slightly in my hand. The barn doors were securely closed, the heavy wooden beams still in place exactly as Robert had left them. No signs of disturbance. No evidence that anything had tried to force its way out. Relief flooded through me as I turned back toward the cottage, grateful that this part of the night's ritual had passed without incident. Back in bed, I set my final alarm for 5 a.m., giving myself time to prepare for whatever the dawn hours might bring. Sleep was impossible, but I lay in the darkness with my eyes closed, trying to rest my body even if my mind refused to shut down. At 5:15 a.m., 3 sharp knocks echoed from the front door. I sat up immediately, my heart jumping into overdrive. The knocks were deliberate and evenly spaced, exactly as Margaret's list had described. I slipped out of bed and moved toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. Following the rule precisely, I approached the front door and knocked back 4 times against the solid wood. The sound seemed too loud in the pre-dawn quiet, but I forced myself to match the rhythm and intensity of what I'd heard. Then I waited. Silence stretched for nearly a minute before a single knock responded, coming from directly in front of the door. Heavy footsteps began moving away from the cottage, heading toward the front yard. I crept to the bedroom window, pressing my face against the glass to get a view of whatever was leaving. A figure walked across the yard in the pale pre-dawn light, moving toward the tree line that bordered the property. But everything about it was wrong. The proportions, the movement, the way it seemed to flow rather than walk with normal human gait. The thing had to be nearly 8 feet tall, with arms that hung too long and a neck that bent at an impossible angle. I watched until it disappeared into the shadows between the oak trees, my breath fogging the window glass. Even after it was gone, I remained at the window, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The cottage felt like a tiny island of safety in an ocean of things that wanted to tear me apart for making the wrong choice. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in gradual shades of gray and gold. I never went back to sleep, instead sitting in the living room chair until full daylight made the world feel normal again. But Margaret's warnings had taken root in my mind with absolute clarity. This wasn't a job where I could make mistakes and learn from them. This was survival, pure and simple. The things that lived on this property operated by rules I was only beginning to understand, and breaking those rules meant death in ways I probably couldn't imagine. I finally understood what I'd gotten myself into. My hands shook as I pushed food around my plate, the fork feeling too heavy in my grip. The chicken sat untouched, growing cold as I stared at it without really seeing anything. Each time the old farmhouse creaked or settled, my shoulders jerked upward like someone had shocked me with electricity. Robert watched me from across the table, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd barely touched his own dinner, too focused on studying my obvious distress. Margaret ate in silence, but I could feel her eyes tracking my every nervous movement. "Emily." Robert's voice was gentle, the tone someone might use with a spooked horse. "You barely ate anything yesterday either." I set down my fork, giving up the pretense of eating. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks, twisted too tight to accept food. "I'm not really hungry." "You need to keep your strength up," Margaret said, though her voice lacked its usual firmness. "What you're dealing with. It's going to get harder before it gets easier." Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Maybe you should sleep in the main house tonight, just this once." The suggestion hit me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. The idea of spending the night somewhere that felt safer, somewhere with Robert and Margaret nearby, made my chest loosen with relief. But Margaret's reaction killed that hope instantly. "No." Her voice cut through the air with absolute finality. "She has to stay in the cottage." Robert's face showed surprise. "Margaret, look at her. She's exhausted, terrified." "The entities are specifically tied to whoever lives in the cottage," Margaret explained, her tone taking on that lecture quality I'd come to recognize. "That's how the treaty works. Moving her would break the agreement and put all of us in danger." I wanted to argue, to beg them to reconsider, but the logic made sense in the twisted way everything on this farm made sense. The black dog came to my door. The barn check was my responsibility. The knocks came to the cottage where I lived. Moving me somewhere else would probably just make everything worse. "How long does this go on?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "How long before they stop testing me?" Robert and Margaret exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that communicated entire conversations I wasn't privy to. Margaret answered first. "It depends. Some people they accept quickly, others." She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "The ones who died," I said, forcing myself to voice what we were all thinking. "They never got accepted, did they?" Robert's expression darkened. "Some of them were rejected because they couldn't follow the rules. Others..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Others were rejected because they weren't strong enough to maintain the balance." The word balance stuck in my mind as I retreated to the cottage after dinner. Margaret had used it before. This idea that the rules weren't just about my survival, but about maintaining some kind of equilibrium between their world and whatever existed alongside it. I was apparently part of that equation now, whether I wanted to be or not. I spent the evening hours checking and rechecking everything. 6 cans of tuna arranged in the refrigerator, phone charged and ready. Alarm set for 2:15, 3:03, and 5 a.m., every lock secured. But no amount of preparation could calm the anxiety eating away at my insides. By midnight, I was pacing the small living room like a caged animal, too wired to sit still. The cottage felt smaller each night, the walls pressing closer as darkness deepened outside. Each shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and every ordinary sound made me flinch. When my alarm buzzed at 2:15, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling and counting down the minutes. I turned off the phone and moved toward the back door, my legs unsteady but functional. The scratching started exactly on schedule, but tonight it sounded different. Heavier, more deliberate, like whatever was out there was pressing its full weight against the wood. I opened the door and stepped back as the massive black dog pushed inside, bringing its usual wave of unnatural cold. But something was immediately wrong. As the animal walked across my kitchen floor, it left behind wet paw prints on the tiles, dark, glistening marks that looked almost black in the dim light. The night was completely dry. I'd checked the weather obsessively, and there hadn't been rain in over a week. The dog's fur should have been as dry as everything else outside, but instead it dripped some kind of moisture that left puddles wherever it stepped. I grabbed a can of tuna with shaking hands, opened it, and placed it on the floor. The dog moved to the food, but paused before eating, lifting its massive head to study me with those yellow eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw something that looked almost like recognition. Not just awareness, but familiarity, as if it had been watching me for longer than just these few nights. The animal ate in its usual silent way, then settled onto the kitchen tiles. But tonight, the wet prints kept appearing around its body, spreading outward like it was slowly leaking whatever dark liquid clung to its fur. The smell was wrong too. Not wet dog, but something metallic and sharp that made my nose burn. At 2:45, the dog vanished, leaving behind only the wet marks on my floor. I grabbed a towel and wiped them up, trying not to think about what I was cleaning, or why the cloth came away stained dark red. My 3:03 alarm felt like a death sentence. Walking across the yard to check the barn had become the part of the night I dreaded most, the moment when I left the cottage's relative safety for the open darkness where anything could be waiting. But the rules were clear, and Margaret's warnings about the consequences of breaking them echoed in my head with each step. The barn doors hung wide open. Both massive wooden panels had been pushed back completely, revealing an interior so black it seemed to swallow my phone's flashlight beam. Robert had installed industrial lighting throughout the barn. I'd seen it during my first day tour, but none of it was working. The darkness inside wasn't just the absence of light. It was something thick and wrong, like staring into a hole that went deeper than the building's actual dimensions. Following the rule exactly, I pulled out my phone and called Robert's number. It rang twice before his voice answered, rough with sleep but immediately alert. "Emily, what's wrong?" "The barn door's open." "Wide open." Silence stretched for several seconds before Robert responded. "Both doors?" "Yes, and the lights aren't working inside. I can't see anything." "Don't go near it. Don't even look into it too long. Go back to the cottage and watch from your window." The phone went dead, leaving me standing alone in the yard with my flashlight beam creating a small circle of safety in the darkness. I followed Robert's instruction, practically running back to the cottage and positioning myself at the bedroom window with a clear view of the barn. 10 minutes later, Robert emerged from the main house carrying what looked like a shotgun. He walked across the yard with determined steps, but even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. Whatever was wrong with the barn, he knew it was serious. Robert disappeared into the black opening, and the darkness seemed to swallow him completely. My phone showed 3:15 a.m., then 3:20, then 3:30. Each minute felt like an hour as I pressed my face against the window glass, watching for any sign of movement or light from inside the barn. At 3:35, Robert emerged, but he looked like he'd aged years in the span of 30 minutes. His steps were unsteady, and he leaned heavily on the shotgun like a walking stick. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see the exhaustion weighing down his entire body. He spent several minutes doing something at the barn doors, installing what looked like a heavy padlock on a chain, before turning toward the cottage and giving me a thumbs up. The gesture should have been reassuring, but the way his arm moved was sluggish and defeated. I watched Robert walk back to the main house, his pace slow and labored. Whatever he'd encountered in that barn had taken something out of him, left him drained in a way that physical exertion couldn't explain. When he disappeared inside the house, I remained at the window, staring at the now closed barn doors and wondering what horrors had been waiting in that unnatural darkness. My 5 a.m. alarm never went off. I woke at 4:15 to movement outside, my body jerking alert despite my exhaustion. Through the bedroom window, I could see a figure moving through the corn rows that stretched behind the main house. Robert was working in the fields, which seemed normal enough. Farmers kept odd hours. But something about his movement pattern made my skin crawl. He was moving too fast, not running, but covering ground with a fluid motion that didn't match how a 70-year-old man should move through thick vegetation. Robert flowed between the cornstalks like he was gliding just above the ground, his form barely disturbing the plants as he passed. I remembered Margaret's rule about keeping lights off when Robert worked the fields at night, and I made sure my bedroom remained dark as I watched through the window. But this wasn't the Robert I'd shared dinner with earlier. This figure moved with predatory grace, bending and twisting in ways that suggested joints that bent differently than human anatomy allowed. The thing that looked like Robert worked the rows methodically, but its purpose wasn't clear. It wasn't harvesting or tending to anything visible. Instead, it seemed to be searching for something, moving from row to row with systematic precision that felt more like a hunt than farm work. I pressed myself against the bedroom wall, keeping only one eye at the window's edge as I tracked the figure's movement. Every instinct screamed at me to turn on lights, to call out, to do something to break the spell of wrongness that hung over the scene. But Margaret's rule was absolute. No lights, no interaction, no acknowledgement of whatever worked the fields in the darkness. The false Robert continued its search until nearly dawn, when it simply melted back into the corn rows and disappeared. I remained at the window for another 20 minutes, scanning the fields for any sign of movement. But whatever had been out there was gone. As the first hints of sunrise began lightening the eastern horizon, a voice called my name from somewhere beneath the main house. "Emily? Emily, please, I need help." The voice was unmistakably Margaret's. The same tone, the same slight Midwest accent, the same careful pronunciation of my name. But it was coming from below ground level, from what had to be the basement Margaret had warned me about in her rules. "Emily, something's wrong down here. I'm hurt. Please come help me." I pressed my hands over my ears, but Margaret's voice seemed to seep through my fingers, growing more desperate with each call. The sound carried perfectly across the yard, clear and urgent, and so realistic that my body wanted to respond automatically. "I can't get upstairs. My leg is broken. Emily, please, I need you to come down here." The voice continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, cycling through different approaches, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, sometimes sobbing with apparent pain. It used details that seemed authentic, mentioning the breakfast we'd shared yesterday, referring to specific conversations we'd had about the rules, even incorporating the correct timeline of how long I'd been on the farm. "Emily, you're the only one who can help me. Robert can't hear me from up there. I've been calling for hours." I kept my hands pressed against my ears until they ached, humming under my breath to block out the sound. But Margaret's voice was persistent, designed to trigger every helpful instinct I possessed. The thing in the basement knew exactly how to sound like someone I cared about, someone who needed me. As true dawn approached, the voice grew increasingly frantic, abandoning its careful manipulation for raw desperation. "Emily, don't leave me down here, please. I'm bleeding. I'm going to die if you don't help me." The pleas continued until sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. Only then did the voice finally stop, leaving behind a silence that felt almost as unsettling as the calls for help had been. I remained in the bedroom until full daylight flooded the cottage, my hands still covering my ears even though no sound remained. Margaret's fourth rule had been crystal clear: never answer the old woman's voice calling for help from the basement. But hearing what sounded exactly like Margaret herself, begging for assistance while claiming to be injured, had tested every fiber of human decency I possessed. When I finally emerged from the cottage an hour after sunrise, the real Margaret was working in her garden behind the main house, tending to tomato plants with steady, uninjured movements. She looked up as I approached, taking in my haggard appearance and obvious distress. "You look like you didn't sleep well," she said, brushing soil from her hands. I almost laughed at the understatement, but the sound that came out was more like a sob. "I heard you calling for help, from the basement, for almost an hour." Margaret's expression darkened, and she stood up from her gardening with sharp, sudden movement. "What exactly did it say?" "That you were hurt, that your leg was broken, that Robert couldn't hear you and I was the only one who could help." I swallowed hard, my throat dry from the night's terror. "It sounded exactly like you." "Good," Margaret said, her tone grim but satisfied. "That means you followed the rule correctly. The moment you respond to that voice, even once, It learns everything about you that it needs to know. I stared at her, processing the implication. Everything. Your fears, your weaknesses, your relationships, your history. Everything that makes you who you are becomes a weapon it can use against you. Margaret picked up her gardening tools and headed toward the house. You survived your 4th night, Emily. That's more than most people manage. But as I watched her walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that surviving and truly living through what I'd experienced were two entirely different things. The cottage door slammed behind me harder than I'd intended, the sound echoing across the morning yard like a gunshot. My legs carried me toward the main house with purposeful strides, fueled by a night's worth of accumulated terror that had finally crystallized into something sharper than fear: anger. I found Robert and Margaret in their kitchen, seated at the same table where we'd shared careful conversations about farm work and weather patterns. But this morning felt different. The polite pretense we'd all been maintaining for 5 days had worn too thin to continue. Margaret looked up from her coffee cup as I walked through the door without knocking. Her face registered immediate concern at whatever expression I was wearing, but I was past caring about social niceties. "I want to know what's really happening here," I said, pulling out the chair across from them and sitting down heavily. No more vague warnings about following rules. No more stories about previous workers who supposedly just quit. I want the truth. Robert set down his newspaper and studied my face with those weathered eyes. Margaret's hand tightened around her coffee mug, her knuckles going white against the ceramic. "Emily," Robert started, but I cut him off. "Last night I watched something that looked like you work the fields, moving in ways that violated basic human anatomy. I listened to something that sounded exactly like Margaret begging for help from your basement for over an hour. 2 nights ago, that dog left bloody paw prints on my kitchen floor. And yesterday morning, you came out of that barn looking like you'd aged a decade in 30 minutes. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the wooden table. "So tell me what this place really is, or I'm packing my car and leaving within the hour." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of chickens pecking around the yard. Robert and Margaret exchanged one of their meaningful looks, but this time the communication seemed to involve resignation rather than secrecy. Robert spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been avoiding this conversation for far too long. "This farm sits on something old, Emily. Something that was here long before my great-grandfather cleared the first fields, long before anyone thought to plant crops or raise livestock." He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "We're not sure what it is exactly. A thin place between worlds, maybe. A crack in whatever keeps things separated that shouldn't meet." Margaret picked up the explanation without missing a beat, her voice taking on that familiar lecture tone. "Whatever it is, it's hungry. It feeds on chaos, on breaking the established boundaries that keep it contained. The rules aren't arbitrary traditions. They're a carefully negotiated truce." "Negotiated with what?" "Entities that existed here before humans arrived," Robert answered. "Things that don't follow the same physical laws as our world. The black dog, the figure that mimics my appearance, the voice from the basement, they're all part of the same collective consciousness." Margaret stood and refilled her coffee cup, her movements precise and controlled. "Robert's great-grandfather tried to fight them when they first appeared. He lasted 6 months before they took him. His son was smarter. He learned that these things could be reasoned with, contained to specific times and behaviors." "What do they want?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "To break free," Robert said simply. "To expand beyond the boundaries of this property and into the wider world. The rules keep them satisfied enough to maintain the status quo, but they're always testing for weaknesses." Margaret returned to her seat, fixing me with that intense stare I'd come to recognize. "You asked about previous workers. 14 people have worked here over the past 10 years. 12 left after the first week when they realized what they were dealing with. And the other 2? They thought they were smarter than a century of experience, Margaret said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. One decided the rules were superstition and could be ignored. We found his clothes folded neatly on his bed, exactly like what happened to Robert's great-grandfather. The other tried to modify the rules, to negotiate new terms on his own. Robert's face darkened. We never found any part of him, just scratches on every surface of his room, like something with very large claws had spent hours tearing the place apart. The information settled into my mind with horrible clarity. These weren't ghost stories or rural legends. They were operational procedures for survival in a place where the normal world had broken down at some fundamental level. "Why me?" I asked. "Why hire anyone at all if it's this dangerous?" "Because the entities require a human presence in the cottage," Margaret explained. "That's part of the treaty. Someone has to be there to acknowledge them, to feed them, to check the barn. Without that interaction, they become unstable." "Unstable how?" Robert and Margaret exchanged another look, but this one carried genuine fear. "The last time we left the cottage empty for more than a week, things started appearing in town," Robert said quietly. "A black dog the size of a small horse walked through the main street at noon. People started hearing voices calling for help from empty buildings. The sheriff came out here asking questions we couldn't answer. The implications of what they were telling me hit like a physical weight. This wasn't just about my survival. It was about containing something that could spread beyond the farm's boundaries if the careful balance was disrupted. I spent the rest of the morning processing what I'd learned, walking the property lines and trying to see the familiar landscape through new eyes. The peaceful farmland, the well-maintained buildings, the orderly rows of crops, all of it was camouflage for something fundamentally wrong with this place. By afternoon, I'd made my decision. The smart choice would be to pack my belongings and drive away as fast as possible. But the thought of these entities breaking free, of black dogs wandering through suburban neighborhoods, or voices calling for help from basement windows across the country, made leaving feel like cowardice. Robert and Margaret had been maintaining this terrible responsibility for decades. If I abandoned them now, would they be able to find another worker willing to take on the risks? Or would they eventually be forced to let the cottage sit empty while these things grew stronger and more desperate for freedom? As evening approached, I prepared for my 5th night with methodical attention to every detail. I checked my phone's battery level twice, arranged 8 cans of tuna in the refrigerator instead of 6, and set all 3 alarms with backup notifications. Whatever was coming, I would be ready. But even my careful preparations couldn't have anticipated what happened at 2:17 a.m. The scratching started on schedule, but it sounded different, deeper, more aggressive, like multiple sets of claws working against the wood simultaneously. When I opened the back door, 2 massive black dogs sat waiting on the concrete step. Both animals were larger than the single dog I'd encountered on previous nights, their dark fur absorbing light so completely they seemed like holes cut out of reality. 4 yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory intelligence, and the temperature drop was so severe my breath immediately became visible in the sudden cold. I stepped back as both dogs entered my kitchen, their synchronized movements suggesting coordination that went beyond normal animal behavior. The cold they brought felt different too. Not just the absence of warmth, but something that seemed to leach heat from my bones and leave my muscles sluggish and unresponsive. Following the rule as closely as possible, I grabbed 2 cans of tuna from the refrigerator and opened them with hands that shook despite my determination to stay calm. I placed both cans on the kitchen floor and retreated to the far side of the room. The dogs moved to the food but didn't eat immediately. Instead, they began circling my small kitchen table, their massive forms moving with fluid grace around the furniture. Each breath they took was wrong, too slow, too rhythmic, like mechanical bellows rather than living lungs. The sound filled the kitchen with an unnatural pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. 10 seconds in, 15 seconds out, both dogs breathing in perfect unison. They circled the table for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, their yellow eyes never leaving my face. I pressed myself against the kitchen counter, afraid to move or make any sound that might change whatever they were evaluating. The message was clear. They were studying me, testing my reactions, learning something about my behavior that they hadn't needed to know before. Eventually, both dogs moved to their respective tuna cans and consumed the food in that same silent, mechanical way I'd witnessed before. But instead of settling onto the kitchen tiles afterward, they remained standing, positioned between me and both exits like sentries blocking any escape. At 2:45, they vanished simultaneously, taking the oppressive cold with them. I waited several minutes before moving, making sure they were truly gone before cleaning up the empty cans and preparing for the next checkpoint. My 303 alarm felt like a death sentence. The barn check had become increasingly dangerous each night, and after Robert's obvious exhaustion following the previous evening's incident, I had no idea what might be waiting in that darkness. The barn doors hung wide open, exactly as they had the night before. But this time the heavy padlock Robert had installed was completely gone. Not cut or broken, simply absent, leaving behind scratched and gouged metal where something had torn it away with enough force to leave deep grooves in the steel door frame. Following the rule precisely, I called Robert's number. The phone rang once before switching to voicemail, his recorded voice telling me to leave a message. I tried again with the same result. Standing alone in the yard with my flashlight beam creating a small circle of safety, I watched the barn's black interior and tried to decide what to do. The rule said to call Robert if the door was open, but it didn't specify what to do if he didn't answer. 10 minutes later, a figure emerged from the main house and began walking toward the barn. Even in the dim moonlight, I could tell it was Robert. The right height, the right build, wearing the same jacket I'd seen him in earlier that evening. But his movement was wrong. Instead of Robert's steady, purposeful stride, this figure walked with jerky, unnatural steps that suggested joints bending in directions human anatomy couldn't accommodate. Its head turned too far to the left as it scanned the yard, rotating nearly 180 degrees before snapping back to face forward. I pressed myself against the cottage wall and watched as the thing that looked like Robert approached the barn. It paused at the entrance, tilting its head at an impossible angle before disappearing into the black interior. Whatever happened inside occurred in complete silence. No footsteps, no sounds of activity, nothing to indicate what the false Robert might be doing in that darkness. After 30 minutes, the figure emerged and walked back toward the main house, with that same unnatural gait. I waited until it disappeared inside before returning to the cottage, my mind racing with questions about what I'd witnessed and where the real Robert might be. My 5 YAO-AM alarm went off at exactly 5 through, but the expected 3 knocks didn't come until 5:20. When they finally arrived, they sounded different, heavier, more insistent, like something was putting significant weight behind each impact against the wood. Following the established pattern, I approached the front door and knocked back 4 times. But instead of the single return knock I'd learned to expect, multiple responses came from different directions around the cottage. One knock from the front door, as usual, but also single knocks from the direction of the back door, from both bedroom windows and from what sounded like the cottage's roof. The sounds came in sequence, each one delivered with deliberate precision that suggested coordination between multiple entities. Heavy footsteps began moving around the cottage's exterior, not heading away toward the tree line but circling the building in a slow, methodical pattern. Through the bedroom window, I caught glimpses of multiple figures moving through the yard, tall shapes that moved with that same fluid, wrong motion I'd observed in the false Robert. The circling continued until full dawn painted the eastern sky, accompanied by occasional knocks that seemed to test different points around the cottage's perimeter. Whatever was out there was mapping the building, learning its layout and testing its boundaries in ways that felt distinctly different from previous nights. When sunrise finally brought an end to the activity, I remained pressed against the living room wall for another hour, listening for any sound that might indicate the entities hadn't truly departed. The cottage felt smaller than ever, less like a sanctuary, and more like a carefully designed trap where I was the bait for something I was only beginning to understand. But Margaret's words from breakfast echoed in my head with growing clarity. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was about maintaining a delicate balance that kept these things contained to one isolated farm in rural Indiana. The alternative was letting them loose on a world that had no idea such things existed. The rules were breaking down, and something was testing the boundaries of the century-old truce. But running away would only make the problem someone else's responsibility, and there was no guarantee these entities wouldn't follow me beyond the property lines. I had survived my 5th night, but barely. And from the escalating pattern of encounters, I suspected the real test was still coming. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I moved through the cottage, checking every lock 3 times and pulling all the curtains closed. The supernatural activity should have ended at sunrise, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. Every creak of the old building made my shoulders jump, and the silence outside felt wrong somehow. Too complete, like the world was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself the danger had passed, that daylight meant safety the way it had on previous mornings. But something fundamental had shifted during the night. The entities weren't following their established patterns anymore, and the careful balance Robert's family had maintained for generations was starting to crack. Around 8 in the morning, just as I'd begun to relax slightly, the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate steps circled the cottage's exterior in a slow, methodical pattern that made my blood turn to ice. These weren't the natural sounds of someone walking around the building. They were too rhythmic, too purposeful, like a predator marking territory or searching for weak points in my defenses. I pressed myself against the living room wall, listening as the footsteps made their circuit around the cottage's perimeter. One complete revolution took exactly 3 minutes, timed with mechanical precision that no human gait could maintain. The sound came through the walls clearly, each step heavy enough to vibrate through the building's frame. After the 3rd circuit, Robert's voice called from somewhere near the front door. "Emily? Emily, are you all right in there? We need to talk to you." The voice was perfect. Robert's familiar tone, his slight Indiana accent, the careful way he pronounced my name. But Robert would never approach the cottage during supernatural activity, and something about the vocal patterns felt rehearsed, like someone reading from a script. I stayed pressed against the wall, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps continued their methodical circles while the voice tried different approaches. "Emily, something's happened to Margaret. She's hurt, and we need your help." A pause, then a shift to a more urgent tone. "Please, we don't have much time." Margaret's voice joined the performance, calling from the direction of the back door. "Emily, dear, come outside. We have something important to show you. Something that will help you understand what's really happening here." The 2 voices alternated their appeals, sometimes overlapping in ways that created an eerie harmony. They knew exactly what to say, referencing our previous conversations, using the right emotional inflections, incorporating details that suggested intimate knowledge of my fears and motivations. But the footsteps never stopped. Whatever was producing those perfect vocal imitations was doing so while maintaining that unnatural circling pattern, and the disconnect between the sounds and their supposed sources made my skin crawl. I backed away from the living room and moved toward the cottage's interior, searching for somewhere with more barriers between me and whatever was outside. The bedroom felt too exposed with its large windows, and the kitchen was too close to the back door where Margaret's voice continued its persuasive calls. The bathroom was the smallest room in the cottage, with only one tiny window positioned too high for anything to see through. I locked the door behind me and wedged the bathroom scale against it for extra security, then climbed into the bathtub and pulled the shower curtain closed around me. The porcelain felt cold against my back, but the enclosed space provided a psychological comfort that the rest of the cottage couldn't offer. I pulled my knees to my chest and tried to block out the sounds from outside, but the voices were persistent and increasingly desperate. "Emily, please! We know you're scared, but you have to trust us." Robert's voice, now tinged with what sounded like genuine panic. "Something's gone wrong with the rules. The entities are breaking through the barriers." Margaret's voice picked up the narrative seamlessly. "We need to evacuate you now before they get stronger. Emily, if you don't come out, we can't protect you." The appeals continued for what felt like hours, cycling through different emotional approaches and escalating urgency. Sometimes they claimed the cottage was about to be overrun. Other times they insisted that staying inside was exactly what the entities wanted. The consistency was perfect, never contradicting previous statements or revealing the supernatural source behind the performance. But through it all, those footsteps maintained their mechanical rhythm. 3-minute circuits, never varying in pace or pattern, creating a percussion that undermined every word the false voices spoke. I stayed curled in the bathtub as the morning stretched on, my muscles cramping from the awkward position, but my mind too frightened to consider moving. The shower curtain created a thin barrier between me and the bathroom door, but it felt like the most substantial protection I'd had since arriving at this farm. Eventually, the voices grew fainter and the footsteps slowed their pace. Real sunlight was streaming through the small bathroom window, bright and warm in a way that felt distinctly different from the wan light that had accompanied the supernatural activity. When someone knocked on the cottage's front door around noon, the sound was completely different. 3 quick raps followed by Robert's actual voice. "Emily, are you okay in there? We haven't seen you all morning." I recognized the difference immediately. This was Robert's natural speaking rhythm, without the rehearsed quality that had characterized the earlier performance. But after hours of listening to perfect imitations, I wasn't ready to trust even authentic-sounding voices. The knocking came again, followed by Margaret's voice. "Emily, we're coming in. We have a key." I heard the front door open and footsteps enter the cottage. Normal footsteps that varied in pace and weight. Nothing like the mechanical circling that had terrorized me all morning. Voices called my name as they searched the small space, moving from room to room with the natural urgency of people genuinely concerned about my whereabouts. "She's not in the bedroom," Margaret said, her voice muffled by distance and walls. "Kitchen's empty too," Robert replied. "Emily, where are you?" When they tried the bathroom door and found it locked, Margaret's tone shifted to immediate alarm. "Emily, are you in there? Are you all right?" I wanted to answer, but my voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. The morning's terror had left me wrung out and unable to form words, even for people I was reasonably sure were the real Robert and Margaret. "We're going to break down the door," Robert announced after several seconds of silence. The bathroom scale scraped against the floor as the door pushed inward, and Robert's weathered face appeared in the opening. His expression shifted from concern to shock when he saw me huddled in the bathtub with the shower curtain pulled around me like a protective cocoon. "Jesus Christ, Emily, what happened?" Margaret squeezed past Robert into the small bathroom, her face pale with worry as she took in my condition. I must have looked terrible. Hours of crammed positioning had left my muscles stiff and aching, and the psychological strain showed in every line of my body. "They were circling the cottage," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse from fear and disuse. "For hours. Voices that sounded exactly like both of you, trying to get me to come outside." Robert and Margaret exchanged one of their meaningful looks, but this one carried genuine alarm rather than their usual careful communication. "How long?" Margaret asked, her tone sharp with urgency. "Since 8 this morning. Maybe longer." I unfolded myself from the bathtub with Margaret's help, my legs unsteady from the cramped position. "They never stopped walking around the building, perfect circles every 3 minutes. Margaret's face went white. "That's not possible. The protective measures should prevent daytime activity." She pushed past Robert and headed for the cottage's front door with determined strides. I followed on shaking legs, curious despite my exhaustion about what had Margaret so agitated. Outside, Margaret moved around the cottage's perimeter with systematic precision, examining the ground near the foundation with intense focus. She paused frequently to study specific areas, sometimes kneeling to touch the dirt or trace patterns I couldn't see. "Here," she called to Robert, pointing at what looked like ordinary soil near the cottage's eastern wall. "And here, the salt lines are broken." Robert joined her, and I could see him examining scratches in the dirt that formed rough geometric patterns around the building's foundation. What I had dismissed as normal wear or animal tracks were actually deliberate markings, carefully maintained barriers that had been systematically destroyed. "I've never seen them break this many lines at once," Robert said, his voice grim. "Usually they test 1 or 2 weak points, see how we respond." Margaret stood and brushed dirt from her hands, her expression darker than I'd ever seen it. "They're not testing anymore. They're preparing for something bigger." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Robert and Margaret worked to restore whatever protective measures had been compromised. Margaret retrieved containers of salt from the main house and began retracing the broken lines around the cottage's foundation, muttering under her breath in what sounded like a completely different language. Robert disappeared into his workshop and returned with metal stakes and lengths of iron chain, which he positioned at specific points around the property with mathematical precision. The chains formed geometric patterns that extended far beyond the cottage, creating a network of barriers I hadn't known existed. While they worked, Margaret explained the additional protective measures I would need to incorporate into my nightly routine. The salt lines required daily maintenance, with specific attention to areas where the entities had shown particular interest. The iron stakes needed weekly adjustment to maintain their effectiveness, and there were additional rules, backup protocols for situations where the primary safeguards failed. "Why didn't you tell me about these before?" I asked, as Margaret showed me how to properly distribute salt in an unbroken line. "Because most workers don't last long enough to need them," she replied matter-of-factly. "The basic rules are usually sufficient to maintain the balance. But something about you is different." Robert paused in his work with the iron stakes and turned to study my face. "How old are you, Emily?" 26. He nodded as if that confirmed something he'd suspected. "Most of our workers have been older, 40s, 50s. People who've already experienced enough of life's hardships to carry substantial fear." "I don't understand." Margaret set down her container of salt and fixed me with that intense stare. "Fear is part of what keeps the boundaries stable. It feeds the entities just enough to satisfy their hunger without making them stronger. But you're young, relatively fearless, and you've been adapting to the supernatural encounters instead of remaining appropriately terrified." The implications settled into my mind with horrible clarity. My growing confidence, my determination to understand and survive the nightly encounters, had been interpreted by the entities as a challenge rather than compliance. Instead of feeding them the fear they expected, I'd been starving them while simultaneously demonstrating that their carefully maintained boundaries could be questioned. "So what do we do?" I asked. Robert and Margaret exchanged another look, this one heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. "That depends," Margaret said slowly, "on whether you're planning to stay." The question hung in the air between us like a physical presence. After 5 nights of escalating supernatural encounters and a morning spent cowering in a bathtub while things that sounded like my employers tried to lure me to my death, the smart choice was obvious. But as I looked around the property in the afternoon sunlight, the peaceful farmland, the well-maintained buildings, the orderly rows of crops that disguised something fundamentally wrong with this place, I couldn't shake Margaret's words about what happened when they left the cottage empty. Black dogs the size of small horses walking through town in broad daylight, voices calling for help from empty buildings, a sheriff asking questions that couldn't be answered. These entities were contained here by a century-old agreement that required human presence in the cottage. If I left, would Robert and Margaret be able to find another worker willing to take on the risks? Or would they eventually be forced to abandon the cottage while these things grew stronger and more desperate for freedom? The thought of supernatural entities breaking loose in suburban neighborhoods, of families hearing voices that sounded like their loved ones calling for help from impossible places, made leaving feel like cowardice. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was about maintaining a responsibility that kept horrors contained to one isolated farm where they could be managed. "I'm staying," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke the words. "But I need to know everything. All the rules, all the protective measures, all the backup protocols you haven't told me about yet." Margaret's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief mixed with resignation. "Then we have a lot of work to do before tonight." The rest of the afternoon was spent learning safeguards I should have known from the beginning. Margaret taught me how to recognize when salt lines had been tampered with, how to reinforce them using specific patterns that disrupted supernatural movement. Robert showed me the locations of emergency supplies hidden around the property, backup generators, additional weapons, communication equipment that worked even when normal phone service failed. They explained the cottage's actual architecture, pointing out reinforced walls and specially treated wood that provided more protection than I'd realized. The bathroom where I'd barricaded myself was actually the safest room in the building, designed specifically as a last resort during supernatural emergencies. By evening, I understood that the cottage wasn't just housing for a farm worker. It was a carefully designed fortress in an ongoing war between human determination and entities that existed according to different physical laws. The rules weren't arbitrary restrictions, but battle-tested strategies developed through generations of trial and error. As I prepared for my 6th night, arranging the familiar cans of tuna and setting my alarms, everything felt different. The routine actions carried new weight now that I understood what I was really protecting. This wasn't just about surviving until morning. It was about maintaining barriers that kept nightmares from spilling into a world that had no idea such things existed. The cottage felt less like a trap and more like a watchtower, a forward position in a conflict most people would never know was being fought. Margaret's additional safeguards created layers of protection I hadn't possessed before, and Robert's emergency supplies provided options beyond simply enduring whatever the entities chose to inflict. But more than the new equipment or expanded protocols, my perspective had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't just a temporary employee anymore. I was a guardian of something much larger than myself. The peaceful Indiana farmland outside my windows concealed horrors that would devastate ordinary communities, and the only thing standing between those horrors and the outside world was a 70-year-old couple and one terrified woman in her 20s. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead it felt clarifying. For the first time since arriving at this farm, I knew exactly why I was here and what needed to be protected. The entities could test their boundaries and escalate their encounters, but they would find me ready with more than just fear and confusion. I settled into the cottage's reinforced walls as darkness gathered outside, my phone alarm set, and Margaret's expanded rules memorized. Whatever came through that back door at 2:17 a.m. would find someone who understood the true stakes of the game being played. The nightly encounters were no longer just about my survival. They were about ensuring certain horrors remained contained to one isolated property where they belonged.